Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to just ask our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Sizwe Mabizela, to give us a short opening message, please.
Your Grace, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba and Sis Lumi, our esteemed keynote speaker, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and friends. It is a signal honor and a great privilege for me to welcome you all to the 6th annual Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Lecture on Values-Based Leadership. It is appropriate and fitting that we should ask Mr. Jonas to address this annual lecture, given his own credentials as a leader who has lived and continues to live and has practiced values-based leadership. 26 years into our democratic dispensation, our nation finds itself lurching from one crisis to the next. There's a growing and palpable impatience. There's disillusionment and disenchantment with the social, economic, and political state of our nation. At various levels of our society, one does not have to look far to see leadership that is bereft of moral and ethical content. One does not have to look far to see growing and intolerable malfeasance and corruption. Indeed, one does not have to go far to see a failing public school system. And one does not have to go too far to see pervasive and debilitating poverty and widening wealth disparity, while others flaunt their ill-gotten wealth. And one does not have to go far to see individuals who are placed in positions of responsibility and who will do all in their power to undermine and discredit institutions created to strengthen, consolidate, and defend our constitutional order. The looting of the funds intended to address the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic took corruption in this country to a different level. But all these challenges notwithstanding, we should never allow apathy, despair, cynicism, or despondency to take root in our society. We cannot afford to lose hope. And we cannot afford to be imprisoned by the current realities. But we must free ourselves to imagine what can be. You see, if you had lost hope or had become cynical, look at the sterling work which is done by the Zondo Commission of Inquiry that has shone light into unprecedented levels of corruption in our society. Look at the rounding up by the hawk. Some of those involved in corruption and malfeasance this past week. Look at our justice system that has remained a bulwark against the evil designs of those who wanted to effect a complete and a total capture of the state. These should go some way to restore our faith and confidence in our constitutional project. For as long as we have leaders like Archbishop Makgoba, leaders like Mr Mcebisi Jonas, there is hope. It is evident that we live in a society that is crying out for leadership, a society yearning for good leadership, caring leadership, compassionate leadership, bold and courageous leadership. A leadership which, in the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, does not only inspire confidence in people, but one that inspires people to have confidence in themselves. The people of our country deserve more. We deserve better. Once more, a very warm welcome to you all, and we look forward to a lecture by Mr. Jonas. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mabizela. So my name is Owen Skay. I'm the director of Rhodes Business School, and I will be your master of ceremonies or person of ceremonies for tonight. If I was in Makanda, I'd be saying Molweni, but I'm in Durban, so I'm going to say Sanbona. And greetings and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. In 2014, the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust made an endowment to Rhodes Business School to host an annual lecture on values-based leadership. This is our 6th annual lecture. Our first speaker was advocate, now Professor Thuli Madonsela. Second speaker was former President Kgalema Motlanthe. Our third speaker was former First Lady, Mrs. Graça Machel. Our fourth speaker was former Member of Parliament, Dr. Makosi Khoza. And our fifth speaker was Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman of Gift of the Givers. The order of proceedings tonight is that I'm going to shortly ask our Grace, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, to say a short prayer. Then we're going to announce the prize winners of our first National Bank Economics Prize winners, and I'll say a short citation, followed by the announcement of the Responsible Leadership Prize short citation, and that prize is sponsored by the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust. Then I'll introduce our speaker. So I will be introducing Mr. Jonas later. Mr. Jonas will then give his annual lecture, followed by a Q&A, and you are more than welcome to post questions in the Q&A, please. We can't promise that we'll be able to deal with all those questions. Then there'll be a vote of thanks from the 2019 MBA class president, Mr. Tsuma Dube, and we will then conclude the evening's proceedings. Without any further ado, I would now ask that Archbishop Thabo Makgoba say a short prayer.
Let us pray. Lord God, we thank you for the partnership that the Trust has, University, Rhodes University, and with the Business School. We thank you that you're a God that treats each human being as a gift from God. And so as we listen to Mr. Jonas, we pray for an openness of heart among South Africans so that they may hear the message of the importance of values anew, so that they may be courageous in implementing what he has to say. Lord, often we lament at how many take from the vulnerable and the poorest of the poor. So inspire us, Lord. And so be with us listen to Mr. John, and as we commit to doing something about to say today, these prayers we offer in your precious name. Amen.
Thank you, Your Grace. I'd also just like to acknowledge that we have a live audience tonight. So we have SPA, the MGP program I'm facilitating here in Durban. So we're really delighted to have SPA present as a live audience. I can assure you that masks are being worn and social distancing is being observed. So just my pleasure now to just announce the First National Bank Prize. Now, First National Bank is the corporate sponsor for the 4th year of this prize for our MBA Economics. It's awarded to the top 3 students based on an essay competition. The essay is themed on social justice and equality. These essays are assessed anonymously. In other words, there's a blind review process. And thank you again to our adjudicators this year, Professor Gavin Keaton from the Rhodes Economics Department, and Chantal Marks, who is the head of research and content at First National Bank Wealth and Investments. So we really would like to thank in particular First National Bank, Mr. Mcebisi Magugu, who has always been a stalwart in supporting us. And thank you to Evert Knudsen, who is the course coordinator. So the prize finalists this year were John Rowland, Sean Thackeray, Craig Chambers, and Surgeon Ntombeni. And without any ado, I announce that third prize was jointly shared by Sean Thackeray and Surgeon Ntombeni. The second prize went to Craig Chambers, and that means that the first prize went to John Rowland. So congratulations to all our prize winners. And Charmaine is just showing on your screen, you can see there who they are. Thank you, Charmaine. And we can proceed to the third slide, and I will then quickly read the citation for that. The adjudicators said about this piece of work, it's an impressive work for what I imagine are mostly non-economists. I really enjoyed reading the essays. I like the use of unemployment as a link between growth and development. The focus on both growth and development continuously separates this piece from the others. I appreciate that the author did not remove Cuba from the analysis when she saw that it did not fit the narrative. Good insight was shown into why Cuba's data looks different to economic unfree nations. So congratulations to our First National Bank Economics Prize winners. So next on the agenda is the announcement of the Responsible Leadership Prize citation. And normally we do ask that the Archbishop reads the citation, but as you can see tonight, the Archbishop was in his car earlier because he wanted to make sure to get somewhere, but there was some issues. So given the connectivity problem, the Archbishop has asked that I read the citation. And then he will just say something at the end about that. Okay. So the winner this year of the Responsible Leadership Prize is Matthew Shaw. And the citation is, leadership is an elusive and complex topic. It is not one particular instant, nor is it ongoing. It is contextual. Companies face limitations due to various factors which may be mitigated by the implementation of an appropriate leadership style identified as the meaningful change leadership model, which finds its roots in servant leadership and Ubuntu. This model is deemed appropriate along with the consideration of the aspects of emotional intelligence as it directly links to the context of the problems being faced in the organization. It is critical that leadership evaluates its emotional intelligence and makes the necessary changes recommended. It must be understood that these are large-scale changes and that they will not happen instantaneously. Staff and leadership must have patience as each member of staff adapts to the changing environment. In order to create alignment, we need to make meaningful change, have meaningful conversations, and allow for meaningful engagement as per the meaningful change leadership model. Your Grace, is anything you'd just like to add to what I said there, please? Okay, it seems that we have momentarily lost connectivity. Your Grace, anything you just want to add to the citation? Okay, so you just need to unmute yourself there. Thank you.
I just want to say congratulations. Those are the types of leaders that we need in our country.
Thank you, Your Grace. So now I'm pleased to say that we are ahead of schedule and not any attempt to rush through, but we now come to the raison d'etre for the 6th lecture. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Mcebisi Hubert Jonas was born in 1960 in Uitenhage in the Eastern Cape. He matriculated at Newell High School in Port Elizabeth and obtained a Bachelor of Arts in History and Sociology at Vista University. He furthered his studies with a Higher Diploma in Education at Rhodes University. So we're delighted to have you back, even though it's virtually at your alma mater tonight. Mr. Jonas's roots in the Eastern Cape run very deep. During the anti-apartheid years, he led a number of political activities, both within South Africa and in exile. He played a key role in the establishment of the United Democratic Front in the Eastern Cape. Upon his return from exile in the 1990s, Mr. Jonas was central to establishing the ruling African National Congress structures in the Eastern Cape. With the advent of our new democracy, he played a key political leadership role in the Eastern Cape. Amongst other provincial ministerial positions, he served as a finance MEC in the province, the Chief Executive Officer of the Eastern Cape Development Corporation, a state-owned entity which successfully amalgamated various smaller development institutions. He also served as Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for Investment and Marketing in the Eastern Cape, developing the investment promotion agenda for the province, which resulted in the establishment of the ECDC, the Cook Industrial Development Zone, and the East London Industrial Development Zone. He previously served as the Deputy Minister of Finance and as a Member of Parliament from 2014 to 2017. During this time, he helped to steer South Africa's economy through one of the country's most difficult post-democratic periods. He also served as Chairperson and Non-Executive Director of the Public Investment Corporation, the state-owned pension fund manager and one of Africa's largest investment managers. As he relates in his book, After Dawn, Hope After State Capture, in October 2015, he was offered the position of Minister of Finance in exchange for 600 million rand. Needless to say, he turned down the bribe, after which a period of deep introspection followed for him. The question is posed in his book: how did we reach this point? And what did the future hold for South Africa's democracy and the economy? Mr. Jonas's activism has defined his political and business career, and the country can be especially grateful for the seminal role he played in the courageous pushback against state capture. He is one of 4 presidential investment envoys appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa to attract $100 billion of investment to South Africa. He serves as a non-executive director in different company boards and as the non-executive chairperson of MTN Limited. Before I hand over to Mr. Jonas, I'd just like to relate a very short story that the Archbishop shared with us a couple of years ago. And really that's to say that the Archbishop and Mr. Jonas have known each other for a very, very long time. And the story is this: there was a close connection between the Black Students Movement and St. Paul's Anglican Society back in the 1980s. And within Anglican Society, some of the Release Mandela campaign members were also involved, and the Archbishop himself was a member of both. From time to time, the representatives of the Black Students Movement in St. Paul's would meet to discuss the struggle and the freedom. Now, at that particular time, Mr. Jonas was in the sights of the most feared security police person who shall remain nameless. He probably doesn't deserve a mention, but he was feared. And I'd like to say, Mr. Jonas, that you weren't in hiding, you were just being discreet in the way that you were avoiding this person. And I think that, you know, we can smile about this now, but for those of us who lived through that era, there's no doubt that this was terrifying. And so what would happen is that Mr. Jonas would visit with Edgar Trula, KK Papiana, and they would brief the students on what was happening. And whilst that was going on, this particular security police person would be ransacking the res and ransacking the BSM offices. But as I mentioned, Mr. Jonas would be discreetly briefing colleagues at St. Paul's. So really what it demonstrates is that the role that the church played in the struggle, you know, I think we must not ignore the seminal role that the church itself played in the anti-apartheid struggle. And what I'd like to conclude by saying is that in preparation for tonight, I came across a master's thesis that was done by Sean Grayling, a Master of Arts, back in 2007. And he makes note of the fact that on the second occasion when Papiana was detained, and Mr. Jonas himself was detained by the security police, on the second occasion, and I happened to be a student myself at Rhodes then, 2,500 students marched from the main admin block down to the police station at New Street in order to express their displeasure at what had happened. Mr. Jonas, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Owen Skay. Let me thank Your Grace, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, the Thabo Makgoba Foundation, the Vice Chancellor, and the Rhodes University Business School for inviting me to give the annual lecture tonight. I greet all leadership and friends present. I must admit upfront that I haven't completely adapted to this online format of lectures. I'm always nervous that somebody might be half listening to what I'm saying, probably watching TV or even cooking, or even involved in more serious activity than listening to a lecture. It is a truism to say that COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. But it has done this to a world that was already upturned and upset. For some time, the writing has been on the wall that we are well on the downward side of the end curve of an era. The 40-year period of neoliberalism dominated by finance capital and enabled by computer technology. It is an era that has seen the global top 1%ers getting obscenely rich, while the general living standards of the middle class and working classes have been deteriorating. It is very clear that the future sustainability of generations has been increasingly compromised and compounded by the global financial shocks, rising structural unemployment, and of course the effect of climate change. The economist Perez suggests that we are on the cusp of a dramatic technological and economic disruption, which will bring with it massive changes in the production, consumption, and daily life. These transitions are typically characterized by great turbulence before the next, what he terms, golden age of prosperity. COVID-19 has amplified the disruption and accelerated the transition to the next techno-economic era. Perez is positive that the new golden age will be better, greener, more anchored in solidarity, and with shared 4IR related benefits in energy, transport, and communication. But we are not yet there. And realistically, things are likely to get worse before they get better, including greater economic turmoil, unfavorable geopolitics, and increased attacks on democracy by demagogues and populists. I think all activists, leaders, and citizens globally are duty-bound to ensure we get through this transitionary period with our core values intact. We need to combat the politics of fear and distraction that thrives in periods of turbulence, such as ours. We need a new politics built around authenticity, a new moral code, and the belief that a better world is possible. We need leaders rooted in an unshakable ethical foundation to steer us through the triple whammy we now face, namely the COVID pandemic and the greatest economic crisis of the past century, and secondly, the global assault on democracy, and thirdly, what Robert Weinberg calls the pandemic in slow motion, climate change. I will argue that we need values-based leaders to pivot and reverse the downward trajectory globally, continentally, and in South Africa. In considering values-based leadership, I will look at, firstly, whether leadership can be effective without solid moral and ethical foundation. Secondly, what dangers present when leadership is devoid of such values. And thirdly, whether other characteristics beyond values are necessary for effective leadership. I will argue that effective leaders need a combination of attributes, including ethics and authenticity, as a prerequisite. Leaders without this are downright dangerous. I will also argue that effective leaders need attributes beyond values. This includes the qualities usually understood as transformational leadership, and include vision, intellectual influence, charisma to persuade others, and the strength of conviction to push forward in the face of adversity. The benchmark for transformational leadership is changing fast. In the COVID new normal, leadership must become more accepting of complexity. This implies an urgent shift from vision grounded in rigid ideology and grand narratives towards being more adaptive and pragmatic. In South Africa, we seem to have been polarized between overly market-led or state-led development models. This limits the collaborative role that civil society, the state, and the private sector require to play in national development. The market cannot be left alone to allocate resources, given our apartheid inheritance of market concentration, racial inequality, and deprivation. At the same time, the state lacks the resources and wherewithal to drive growth and development. Even strong communist states like China and Vietnam have long understood the mutually reinforcing role that the state and the private sector need to play. Our infatuation with everything state-led has also resulted in an unhealthy convergence between ideology and interest, between social forces made up of well-intentioned ideologues and those intent on using the state power to amass wealth, or you can call them the thieves. The recent attacks on national treasury by those who stood strongly against state capture is probably a case in point. I don't think we realize how close we came to fully fledged kleptocracy. We will do well to study experiences of Russia, Turkey, Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, and others to better appreciate the inherent dangers of kleptocracy and how quickly the state can be repurposed for corrupt gains. These threats have not disappeared. Despite us now having a commander-in-chief who seems committed to cleaner governance, we must recognize that corruption is systemic and deeply rooted in social processes. Carl von Holt, building on the work of scholars like Mustek Khan, Douglas North, argues that corruption in South Africa is closely linked to the process of elite formation. In the context of highly concentrated economy, dominated by big business with excessive market power, opportunities for wealth accumulation by an aspirant elite are extremely limited. Ample international evidence exists to show that institutions will always be under threat when the state-facilitated rents remain the primary mechanism for elite formation. And access to resources becomes constrained, as access to resources become constrained either through declining state rents or governance reforms, potential for elite contestation and even violence escalates. This suggests that sustainably addressing corruption and kleptocracy risks must involve structural and systemic changes, dismantling market power and anti-competitive market behavior, and more proactively supporting the development of a Black, innovative, and entrepreneurial class through a range of productivity-enhancing measures. Unfortunately, our track record here is dismal. In the middle-income countries, the SMME contribution to employment and GDP is 95% and 70% respectively. The South African ratio is 56 and 50% respectively. Moreover, the sector has declined over the past decade. The Black share of income has shifted over the past 20 years, but not the Black share of wealth. Alan Hirsch, in the recent review of the National Development Plan, shows that the Gini coefficient, the measure of income inequality, does little to present the real picture of inequality in South Africa. While Gini coefficient has dropped slightly and sits at 0.61, with 1 being perfect inequality and 0 being equality. Other classes of asset inequality reveal a far more disconcerting trend. Property asset inequality sits at 0.88, net worth inequality 0.90, and financial asset inequality 0.92. White South Africans make up more than 60% of the elite, with Black Africans comprising of 20%. The fact that the current redress measures like land reform, BBBE, preferential procurement, employment equity, etc., have not adequately addressed patterns of race-based assets inequality, fuels populist narratives, and deepens divisions. This creates more mistrust between business, labor, and the state, which in turn makes trade-offs more difficult to broker. This is the primary challenge for transformational leadership in South Africa. We need a new vision and development model. Our current model built around free market growth and expansive fiscal redistribution program of social grants, free basic services, housing, and access to free education and health care is no longer delivering outcomes required for social progress and institutional stability. Over the past 25 years, per capita spending by government at constant prices doubled from 12 Rand per person to around 24 Rand currently, resulting in reduced poverty and a consistently improving Human Development Index. This is at the risk as the country enters a period of sustained fiscal distress. Government debt has ballooned since 2008 crisis from 27% of GDP to an estimated 81% of GDP for 2020. Debt servicing has been the fastest growing category of expenditure over the past few years, sitting at 12% for 2020. Even COVID and the recent IMF loan did nothing to actually improve that situation. In rand terms, the debt servicing cost translates into almost 240 billion per annum, enough to cover the budgets of at least 2 provinces. A sovereign debt crisis threatens, especially when taking into account the 300 billion revenue shortfall predicted for 2020 and the growing contingent liability risks of SOCs like Eskom, which alone has a debt of 480 billion. Underlying this position of fiscal distress has been an extended period of economic stagnation. at least for the decade preceding COVID pandemic. Three broad reasons account for this underperformance. The first is South Africa remains path-dependent on commodities exports, financial portfolio inflows as its core sources of growth. Our economy grew almost by 4% yearly in the first decade of the noughties, on the back of what was arguably the largest commodity boom in 50 years. Unfortunately, we've been less successful in diversifying the economy towards new sources of growth, and the country entered a stagnant growth trajectory with downward turn of the commodity cycle in 2013. The depressed commodities demand has been further compounded by COVID recession, which has really hammered commodity exporters like South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, and Angola. The second factor actually accounting for this massive underperformance is the fact that South Africa has been faced with declining economic competitiveness over the past decade. The country has regressed from a high of 35 points on the WEF Global Competitiveness Index in 2017 to a low of 67 points in 2018. Underlying this trend of declining competitiveness has been policy uncertainty, regulatory bottlenecks, the high cost of doing business, especially related to inefficiencies in our network industries like logistics and telecoms. Other countries like Botswana, Mauritius, Kenya, and Rwanda have seen significant competitiveness improvement over the same period. Poor human capital outcomes have also contributed to our declining competitiveness. South Africa scores 0.41 on the World Bank's 2019 Human Capital Index, meaning we are 41% as productive as we could be under optimal conditions of health and education. This is significantly lower than middle income countries, and lower than neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Botswana, despite higher per capita expenditure. In fact, a simple way of looking at South Africa is that we have the cost structures of a middle income country and productivity levels of a low income country. This makes us uncompetitive in the lower segments of the labor market. In essence, we have high unemployment, and the benefits of high productivity growth are not shared. This produces patterns of structured inequality. The third factor accounting for our underperformance is the broad set of factors contributing to this would be probably what I would categorize as political economy challenges. This includes the power and policy dynamics within the governing party and the tripartite alliance, and issues of factionalism and contestation over distribution of political patronage and rents. This has spilled over into governance of state institutions. You just need to read the Auditor General's report to actually see this. This recently came to a head with the revelations of the state capture and repurposing and hollowing out of state institutions for corrupt gains. The recent arrests, while welcome, I think they will sharpen internal contradictions within the ruling party. The impact of this state inefficiency is illustrated in the work of Marula and Maklov, who show how capital output ratios have changed over time. Between 2000 and 2010, 4 units of investment were required to achieve 1 unit of output. Between 2012 and 2017, this had increased to 12 units of investment, 3 times more investment for the same output. While JP Landman analysis correctly shows the work that President Ramaphosa has done to rebuild SARS, Transnet, Eskom, the NPA, and probably the security cluster in general, we must, however, emphasize that the damage that state capture has afflicted on the economy will take years to repair, and now even longer with the impact of COVID. Increased resource scarcity is likely to further intensify factional contestation, with the coordinated fight back by forces opposed to efforts to clean up the state and to reform the economy. Addressing South Africa's political economic challenges will take bold leadership. The COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated that there is more space for our leadership to be more courageous and more decisive. The pandemic showed us that the scale and pace of change, when we have no choice, happens more quickly and with more ease than we imagine. The research shows that companies which make 3 or more bold moves over a 10-year period are 6 times likely to shift from average to top performance. I think countries are the same. I'm reminded, without commenting on the other aspects of his leadership style, Lee Kuan Yew bold stance in building corruption-free high-performance state as the anchor of Singapore's transition from underdeveloped colony to a high-income economy. Or perhaps Nelson Mandela, closer home, bold leadership in pushing the revolutionary forces to accept the compromise and national reconciliation as the bedrock of a peaceful and stable transition to democracy. Or Deng Xiaoping, leadership in instituting market-related reforms in China in the 1980s, in this case against mainstream orthodox Maoists within the party. Or even in Africa, if you take Olusegun Obasanjo reforms, which allowed Nigeria to transition from military to a civilian rule in 1999. These were all calculated high-risk intervention. But because they were taken, these countries outperformed and actually reached stability. Coming home, the decisiveness which informed our lockdown was unprecedented and warmly received, despite later protestations around irrationality and the PPE corruption. It was as if South Africans were waiting for some bold move from the president. I'm encouraged, of course, now that the president has made another decisive move, drawing a line in the sand against corruption in the ANC. The arrest of the 17 high-profile and politically connected individuals last week signals this intent and is rattling cages right through the system. There is, I hope, no going back. He needs to see this through if he is to maintain credibility in the eyes of ordinary citizens. He must do this even if it unsettles some of his existing support base. The president must also now take another bold decisions on the economic front, getting the economy back on its feet. This will be particularly difficult in an unfavorable global environment. The world is likely to remain in a commodities down cycle for the next few years, at least amidst COVID uncertainty, trade wars, and the increasing bipolar world with US and China jockeying for global control. We await the November US elections results with more than just a passing interest. As things stand, the likelihood of a significant multilateral deal to stimulate global demand looks unlikely, as major G20 countries embrace a new economic nationalism amidst calls to protect jobs and bring production home. Of course, we might also argue that a shimmer of light on the global horizon is the likely deconcentration of global value chain capacity in China, which could offer opportunities for South Africa if we are able to deal with our own competitiveness and productivity issues. Against this backdrop, I would suggest that South Africa must mobilize around a new vision with practical actions that can bring immediate results. These actions can create the short-term traction required to broker trade-offs around which we have dilly-dallied for too long. The following 8 action areas, I would suggest would probably be amongst the core elements of the deal. Attending to the immediate macroeconomic risks associated with the looming sovereign debt crisis, a set of reforms and trade-offs aimed at growing the economy based on rising productivity and innovation, a set of measures to address asset inequality through the intentional creation of a dynamic Black entrepreneurial class, a strong corrupt free state as the precondition for a new moral order, a high-quality education and digital access as a platform for accelerated social mobility, an accelerated just energy transition, and the restructuring of ESCOM and capacitation of NERSA to support this, expanded social protection and social justice built on growing national output and fiscal redistribution, deepened democracy and accountability through shifting from the current party list system towards a more constituency-based system. The question, of course, is whether we have the leadership capacity to galvanize society around a new vision and extract the necessary trade-offs. What kind of leadership do we need at this current moment? And how do we begin assembling it? The simple answer is that we need a values-based leadership that is authentic, has a strong ethical foundation, and exerts idealized influence. Outcomes like corruption-free state and a moral code are essential building blocks of a new shared national development vision, and will only be realized through leaders who are admired and trusted, and whose followers emulate their moral and ethical code. Values-based leaders are more open to shared and collaborative forms of leadership and for knowledge-led decisions. The value of these leadership attributes was recently illustrated in the management of the pandemic, with leaders like South Korea's Moon Jae-in, New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, and Finland's Sanna Marin following the science and implementing measures built on transparency and public trust. In the COVID new normal, it's leaders with ethics, humility, and authenticity that are having impact and have been able to build the requisite trust with their citizens to manage complex transitions. This contrasts sharply with the narcissistic, impulsive, and denialist leadership styles of Brazil's Bolsonaro and the US's Trump. It is no coincidence that US and Brazil have the highest COVID death globally. Transformational leadership attributes without ethical foundation are downright dangerous. Think Charles Manson, Adolf Hitler, or any of the contemporary populists. Steitler coined the term pseudo-transformational leadership to refer to leaders who are charismatic and have transformational attributes, but are driven by narcissism, lack of authenticity, and moral code. I think we can all agree that we have more than a fair share of pseudo-transformational leaders in South Africa. The socio-political impact of this type of a leader can be catastrophic. In a recent study, Ziplat and Levitsky, in their excellent book on how the democracies die, show how democracy is under threat, not from wars or coup d'etats, but from the gradual weakening of democratic institutions and freedoms at the hands of elected leaders. Effectively, what the central message of that study is that democracy dies constitutionally, as opposed to the case of wars. In their systematic analysis of Trump's leadership, they show how democracy is likely to die in the US should the current trajectory continue. In a number of international experiences, the US being one of such experience, center-right political parties are part of the problem, entering into some kind of Faustian bargain and failing to politically neutralize the anti-democratic far right. This recent assault on democracy is also closely associated with the growth of populism. Frank Furedi ascribes the death of internationalism, of intellectualism, as one of the key reasons for the rise of populism. Neither the left nor the right have developed any serious alternatives to the globalized neoliberalism, despite its obvious failures in advancing human progress. The left in particular has retreated to seminar rooms and lecture halls, what Thomas Piketty calls the Brahmin left, leaving their historic constituency, the working class, to the hands of populists who have taken up the space of campaigning around job losses and rolling back social welfare. Leadership ultimately must have a transactional aspect, not in the sense that leaders are for sale, but in the sense that followers must see value in subjugating themselves to leaders. It is the populists and demagogues who seem to have best grasped this transactional aspect of leadership and have used their objective deterioration of living conditions in the middle and working classes to spread fear and hate under the guise of a promise for a better future. One of their tools are sophisticated misuse and effective misuse of social media. These pseudo-transformational leaders exert perverted form of idealized influence. Their followers emulate their immoral code, spreading fear, hatred, racism, and xenophobia, often with violent consequences. This is the politics of fear and regression, which has consumed much of the world, and which for us is but a short step away. In conclusion, it must be our collective mission, both as citizens and as leaders in academia, business, churches, trade unions, civil society, and in political parties, to reset the dial away from this type of politics towards new politics of progression, built around authenticity and fundamental human values. We can no longer sit on the sidelines as spectators and put hope on leaders in formal institutions. Similarly, we cannot sit idly and expect global multilateral institutions to build a better world. We must start thinking more creatively about activist and leadership role we could play in our countries and connecting with others in other countries. Without this agency and mindset shifts, it is highly likely that we will emerge from the current period of turbulence undamaged. The new golden age of prosperity predicted by Paris might be a long time coming. Part of doing things differently is to move beyond preoccupation with political parties and formalistic leadership. Social media has enabled a new cadre of activist leaders like Greta Thunberg, an activist from Occupy Wall Street, who are making real waves and developing new networks of influence outside of the muted institutions of global governance. In all our spaces, we must show interest and quality show our leaders. This is the role of active citizenry. We simply cannot allow individuals who fail the values-based test to assume critical leadership positions. Unfortunately, this kind of meritocratic gatekeeping isn't always possible, especially with political parties who tend to reward patronage rather than values and competence. We must continuously seek new ways to hold elected leaders to account, build robust civil society, and find ways to strengthen our electoral system to prevent elected autocrats from dismantling hard-fought democratic gains. Political parties have become increasingly driven by consolidating power rather than upholding common good. Ziplatz and Levitsky show that political parties are increasingly willing to sacrifice democracy, national unity, social solidarity, and in some instances, even economic stability to retain power. This is the trend we in South Africa need to take seriously. We must ensure that the next generation breaks the cycle of the current politics. Unfortunately, the early signs, judging by our youth politics within the current political parties are not encouraging. We must invest in grooming young values-based leadership across stakeholder groups, and especially in civil society, given their watchdog role and advocacy. This is how we can begin to reverse the damage that our generation has inflicted. We owe it to the future of our country. I thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Mr. Jonas. So, as you said at the start, we're all adjusting to this virtual world, and I think that as we see with sport now, those that love sport, which I guess is most all of us in relation to sport, but watching sport and it's not live isn't quite the same. So there would have been tumultuous applause at this point, I can assure you. So having said that, we are inviting people to post questions now, and I think it's quite sobering because there were so many powerful messages that you put there, many punches that you didn't pull. So if I could just start off by saying that, what prompted you to write your book? What was that moment that you said, no, I need to write a book to talk about my experiences? And perhaps there's just one or two things in your book that you would like to highlight, and then we can start to address the questions as they start coming into the Q&A.
Obviously, there are many reasons, of course. I mean, the first probably big issue for me is that I think debate in South Africa, I notice, has probably been so narrow, and I think we've probably kind of ran a period where there were no big ideas coming from our political parties, particularly, the ANC. And I think it was almost like we're rehashing the old narratives, basically. So part of, I think, writing the book was to try to take a slightly different look at where things are, and try to generate debate on the bigger issues that we're confronted with. And probably, hopefully, somebody would realize the importance of creating new trade-offs. I think that is one part of it. The second part, I think, is that the ideas in South Africa at a political level, even economic policy generally, is increasingly shifting from experts talking about these things. And I think we need knowledge-led solutions to the problems we face. And again, part of what I was trying to do is to try and kind of put as much information and facts into the book that allows for a knowledge-based creation of knowledge-based solutions. And I knew that the book would not actually change the world, but at the same time, I think you would also have a reference point about some of the challenges that we continue to have.
I'm pleased to see that the questions are coming in now quite fast. So I think the first two questions, one from the Archbishop and somebody, Sanola Tandu, also similar related question. The actionable steps for the youth, and why a reluctance to hand over to the younger generation?
I guess this is not a South African thing necessarily. A case where you have a period of transition, so to speak, where basically you have to move from one generation to the other. It's a common thing, I think, that you'd have that. But historically, if you think about the period in 1976 and the period in the 80s, the transition was smooth. And it was smooth because, I would argue that the movement or the political parties were stronger, and they were playing a more dynamic filtering role of leadership. And I think one of the things that make democracy suffer most, and certainly in South Africa, is the fact that political parties have lost their capacity to filter leadership, and partly because of patronage, and partly because themselves they've become weaker in ways that we have not quite imagined and understood. So that makes the whole transition to youth difficult. But I also remember that I think we have a generation of leaders for the first cycle of the democratic transition who know nothing except the fight against apartheid. And I think that there's been no serious management of the transition beyond that point. But again, I'm saying on a positive note, I see quite dynamism emerging, not so much from political parties, but you're seeing youth leadership, young Black professionals taking up issues and using the institutions they lead to actually point to a different direction. And also in civil society, you see a lot of youth with fresh thinking that are likely to dynamize leadership debate and or maybe fuel the transition.
So it was inevitable this question was going to come. So I think let's get this question done now. Gupta Gate. What can you share with us from the inside story and your personal experience and really how you managed to resist the multiple pressures to exceed? And I guess that there were certainly other ministers within the cabinet who were like you, who decided to not go that route, and it must have been a tremendous struggle for you to have to deal with this.
I always think that every time I take a public platform, I always think that I can escape this question. It looks like I can't. But in simple terms, I think the first, I would think that, I think it's again, I mean, if you think about the typology of corruption in South Africa, and if you think about the kind of traditional ANC values, I mean, if there's anything like that in the actually existing ANC, but if you think about that in general, I mean, some of the practices of corruption, bribery were things that historically we've always looked at in a negative terms. That's the first thing. The second problem is that I think every time I think about the Guptas, just listening to them and their articulation, you won't fail to realize that there are no values that drive them. And you will not fail to realize that you're dealing with thugs, basically, and criminals, basically. And the fact that they are in the political system even makes it more worrisome about what kind of organization we are and where we go. The fact that they have a relationship with the president even makes this even more complex, as it were. So again, I mean, it's a combination of those factors that you know a thug when you see one, and you don't really need to be educated over thugs, you know. And they kind of like recruit that their agenda is about accumulation and nothing else.
So look, we'll leave the Guptas after, but this next question here. But I think we really want to ask you, when somebody offers you 600 million rand, I mean, what went through your mind at that moment?
Look, I mean, I guess my first gut reaction, I mean, again, this was preceded by a whole discussion of how much they control the political system, how much they control our institutions, etc., etc. So it was also preceded by that discussion. So already, I mean, by the time we reached that point, I was already clear that we are in a crisis as a country. Quite frankly, I never even thought about myself personally at that point. It was like thinking that all the years of struggle, I can see them being like destroyed in a flash, basically. So that's, I think, what agitated me most.
There's a common question that is also asked, and that is, why was it that people within the ANC were not able to do more to withstand this? it's perceived that there's almost a closing of the ranks in the sense that, you know, you didn't air your dirty linen in public, and perhaps they were trying to do changes from within. But often those people that took the stand who didn't come out openly are criticized for not doing enough. So we see Minister Gordon came under fire. There are other cabinet ministers who came under fire. Why is it that you weren't able to actually do more?
Again, I mean, you must also appreciate the nature of leadership within the party. I mean, if you really consider how powerful that institution of presidency is, and I know that sometimes presidents don't realize that, but presidency is a powerful institution. I mean, there are more than 30 instances of, where the critical functions and powers are located in that person. And probably that's a function of the fact that our constitution was drafted with Mandela in mind. But I think that's the reality. I mean, so if people are thinking about more survival, personal survival, and et cetera, the reality is that the president ultimately, in our constitution, is the distributor of the spoils. So he is at the center of managing grants, effectively. And if you're sitting in it, so you can, no matter how strongly democratic you would say the organization is, if you can't oppose that, what internal democracy and all those things with that reality, it's a serious problem. And I hope, and I always say that, I hope part of what comes out of the Zondo Commission will be a rethink of how do you of course, ensure that you have a stronger president, but ensure that in the exercise of some of those powers and of the president, there is some collective process, there is some transparency, etc. Think about it. The president appoints a commissioner of police. He appoints the head of NPA. and you can list some of those things. And in the execution of that role, if you have an incumbent that is rogue, you're likely to have very, very disastrous consequences.
Another question to put you on the spot from one of our MBA students. So Mr. Somponda asks, you spoke about the death of intellectualism to the benefit of populism. Are there leadership examples here in South Africa that best represent that shift? In other words, this is, and please don't feel obliged to name people, but of course it looks like the audience is interested to hear what your views on that are.
We've got ample examples. I might not be, I hate mentioning people's names, but I think we have ample examples of that. Demagogues and basically, and then again, I'm saying also that even our traditional left, used to be very productive in generating new ideas about society and how to approach difficult questions, etc. I think that we are stuck in that front. So yes, you've got lots of examples of pseudo transformational leaders working around.
So I guess that leads nicely into the next question around leadership deficit, and you spoke about leaders for sale. So this is Bongazi Gaza asking this question, and how do we create a situation that leadership is actually incorruptible? So with all this real political power that you have, how do we get real leaders to lead? That's a very practical question. So the temptation to put your fingers in the cookie jar when you have so much power is often there. So how do we hold the leaders to account? Sorry, I interrupted you there, but again, just providing some context around that.
It comes back to accountability. It comes back to building active citizenry. It comes back to ensuring that we are vigilant in protecting institutions. Because again, if your institutions are weak, you are likely to have the most disastrous outcomes that you can ever think. And if you look at the pattern of state capture, it generally at the core of the process has been the weakening of institutions. I always say that if that period could have allowed a year more, the judiciary was the next on the agenda for capture and weakening. And then I'm just saying that I think, and already, I mean, if you look at South African media today, clearly it's far weaker than it was. I mean, clearly we're lucky during those fights against state capture with a strong media, etc. But again, you see the weakening of media as a result of a whole range of other issues, the economic climate, etc., but also the juniorization of journalism in the country. So my point is, I think that if you don't firstly ensure that you have strong institutions and ensure that you guard their independence as much as possible, and of course the active citizenry is very critical in that. And otherwise, without that, you're likely to have the most disastrous consequences. If you go across them in the continent, you probably have a couple of countries where you have strong electoral commissions. Generally, nobody trusts electoral commissions, and at least in South Africa we still do. But the question, if that process continued, for how long will that situation obtain? And my view is that we would have reached a point where even that core institution of democracy would have started questioning.
So the next three questions are all related to the youth. So Alexander Shukundila asks, why is leadership so important to youth? Gay Evans says the core work can be done to enable youth to rise to the kind of leadership challenges. And then Sav Ingham says, what advice would you give to young people who want to make constructive societal change? So I think generally, although they're specific in themselves, but they also talk to the youth. Leadership for youth. What do we need to do as a country to build capacity in our youth? How do we get our youth to make the societal change that needs to be done?
I mean, when I look back, I mean, in history, I mean, when in the 80s, 70s, I mean, two things that, I mean, drove youth activism and youth leadership. The one, of course, was the fact that you had a stronger movement, broader movement against apartheid, etc. But the second one, I think, was the fact that there was, I mean, education was probably a top issue for many people, despite apartheid education, as it were. So what I think is a problem now is that on the one hand, the bigger movement is weak. So as a result, of course, I mean, where you're looking at models in the political movement, you can't find them. And secondly, I think you have a crisis, I think, of the fact that we need to kind of strengthen education outcomes and maybe rigorously have programs that ensure that we train our youth on leadership issues, but also understanding society in a different ways. Now, how do you achieve that? My view is that I think we should depend less on political parties, and we should actually increasingly depend on civil society organizations and strengthen their role as much as we can, because then that becomes the counterweight, but it also provides some kind of alternative training for youth.
Because interesting that you raised that, and just to go back to the time of fees must fall and roads must fall, and certainly what we found there is that when the political parties said they wanted to come and assist, the students said, go away, you know, we don't want you here, because this is our struggle that we have to deal with. We don't want it to be hijacked by political interests. But in kind of affecting that change, and we're asking this from the point of view of a public higher education institution, what does it mean to affect the kind of change that needs to be done in respecting the rule of law when you're frustrated by the fact that society isn't really changing? So you made reference to the youth under apartheid. Now you were facing an illegitimate regime there. So some of the methods that you use could certainly be justified. But today we're in a democratic country and we have this frustration. How does one deal with the impatience of affecting change without necessarily resorting to the kinds of tactics that would go within the realm of populism and the things that you spoke about? And I think that's the responsibility of youth leadership in that regard.
But again, I'm saying it's not only the youth leadership, it's also a responsibility of leadership in general. I'm just saying that I think programs, we need to enhance the level of engagement with the youth. And we need to do more in terms of showing them alternative ways of looking at what we're confronted with, but also alternative ways of resolving the problems that we're facing, as it were. Ultimately, I think we must face it. I mean, we are in the worst situation as a country in the sense that political parties are generally weak, all of them actually, at the moment. And that, in a sense, might be a positive space to be in. At the same time, it can be a very negative space. Positive space in the sense that it creates all sorts of possibilities for alternatives of all sorts. And it allows a civil society to be more robust. It also allows, I think, for greater mobilization of intellectual activities, not only from campuses, but also across society, as it were. It can also be dangerous because it also kind of open up for all sorts of opportunism, as it were, and therefore can kind of be the ground for fueling populism. But again, I'm saying those who think differently have a greater responsibility of channeling the anger and engaging the youth more in whatever platforms we get involved, but also use our different platforms, whether it's civil society organizations, whether it's our campuses, to try to direct thinking of the youth.
So our Vice Chancellor has asked a very straightforward question. Will the fight back faction put up a serious fight when the hawks start to hover over the heads of some influential leaders who are immersed in state capture? And I think he's saying that it's more than hovering, the claws are now coming and they're actually starting to grab on there. So what is your take on that?
Look, I mean, I look at the thing in two ways. I mean, the one way is that the more you intensify, I mean, the arrest and the kind of push against corruption and state capture, the more political stability you'll face anyway, and the more resistance you'll face. Because sometimes you don't realize that the rot runs deep, actually. And that's probably the challenge. Now, again, it's a matter of leadership, I think, because I know that society in general is tired of corruption. So I think it's a case of looking at party unity and those kinds of things and weighing them against the need for building a more positive image in society and supporting a more progressive line and consolidating society behind a program that is morally just. So I'm just saying that I think that's the choice that South African leadership will have to face all the time. And I think the model that we have in South Africa, where actually increasingly I always make a joke that sometimes I feel we long to have state presidents, not party bosses in State House. And I think that's probably the challenge. I mean, that I think increasingly we'll have to face.
So I can see, although Guy Evans is posting the questions, she's simply the intermediary, because this is the live audience that we have that are obviously feeding the questions through. And a couple of questions are related again to the ANC. And obviously you're a member of the ANC. The question that's being asked, has the ANC failed the National Democratic Revolution? And how will the country recover from the litany of errors that we keep making? And secondly, what is your view on the health of the ANC right now?
Let's start with the last one, but because I didn't come back to that. Look, I mean, I guess, I mean, it's almost public knowledge that the ANC is weaker than it has been, and it faces huge challenges. I mean, just from unity and of course, I mean, challenges around consistency and alignment of forces in driving a common agenda. So that's probably a reality that we face. I take a slightly different view to say, can it fix itself? My argument is that it can't. So ultimately, I think it's going to be society as a whole that actually, and civil society and everyone, all of us, that actually kind of push for a new agenda for the country. There is interesting work that is being done by SACC and a couple of other civil society organizations to pull together a People's Manifesto, actually coalescing the ideas about what do we think about a just South Africa, how it should look like, and what is the South Africa that we're imagining. And I'm saying consolidating those kinds of activities, because it's not just criticizing what's happening, but it's also beginning to put on the table proposals around constructing a new path for the country. The second part, I think, is that, I mean, we've got examples in many countries where the fight against corruption, in the fight against corruption, civil society plays a very powerful role in forcing institutions to take action, and even civil society go to an extent of almost like running a public information leaflets on those who are involved in corruption on a consistent basis, as it were. So I'm saying those kinds of things those are the things that would actually first enhance social awareness in our communities about the dangers and of the state in which we are, but also they would ensure that people understand that our vote matters. And I think that's probably driving this thing towards that process. And again, I'm saying it's not an ANC issue. It's an issue that involves society as a whole.
So some questions now about limiting the power of the president. And what's also interesting about that is that you may recall that the appointment of the SARS commissioner, when Minister Manuel was the minister, the concern always was that if the Minister of Finance appointed the SARS commissioner, that in itself would lead to a conflict of interest. And then when we discovered when the president had the right to appoint the SARS, that commissioner, that was an opportunity to influence that process. So you had all good intentions at the time. As it turned out, through presidential power, one was able to exploit that relationship. How does one limit the presidential power in that regard? How do you limit the powers of any leadership role?
I think one, in my view, I think for every power that you assign to a president or any other institution, you should also outline the process through which this power is exercised. And it's something that I think if you say, for instance, the appointment of the SARS commissioner, if you have an open, transparent process for appointing the SARS commissioner, and even if the decision to appoint then sits with the president, at least you should have a process that is very clearly kind of demarcated and outlined, as it were. And that applies across the public service. I think, my view, I think I've always said that to professionalize public service, one of the things that we need to do is to create an institution that is technically competent in assessing those that are being put forward for the position before the exercise of the political imperative of the appointment. So clearly, there will always be a political imperative, but you need something that says by the time it reaches that stage of the president taking a decision, at least you know that it has gone through some thorough sifting and testing, that those that are put in front of him to choose from, you know that all of them at least could perform the job. So at the present moment, quite frankly, I think, if you think about how Mcebisi was appointed, it was the president deciding that he's appointing Mcebisi. Now, Mcebisi would have failed the litmus test in all respect, even before he kind of went through the process. And you have similar cases where people, if you just analyze their personalities and their capabilities, were bound to be failures in the position that they've been appointed. They get appointed because there's no process that sifts them and so. And it's something that all across the board, where it's not about limiting the powers of the president, but it's ensuring that you have guardrails that ensure that that decision is in the public interest.
Another tough question. How do you actually ensure that there's authentic leadership? How do you know that leaders are authentic?
Look, under normal circumstances, I think when political parties were strong, they used to play that sifting role. But I'm saying in every institution, there is a process of sifting those who cannot make it to leadership, etc. But I think in the absence of that, I would argue that in institutions it might be easier because you have a clearer processes to deal with that. But in public, I think the more we strengthen civil society and the more it plays its role of ensuring that leadership is accountable, the more it can be able to play the gatekeeping role and actually showing that, no, you can't appoint Mcebisi Jonas to that position because it doesn't have the morals and the ethic, and it doesn't know anything about moral codes and so on and so on. And you create a lobby and a debate around that. And I'm saying that's in the first instance. But formally, I think if you have thoroughgoing processes for appointments of leaders, etc., you're likely to have better outcomes.
Yeah, Professor Flynn has made, whether it's a comment or a question, but he says that history might prove that President Ramaphosa's timing was absolutely impeccable. Because again, it comes back to this point about why certain people were not able to effect the kind of change that needed to be done. And by silence, that implied complicity. But he's saying that maybe history will show that President Ramaphosa's timing was impeccable. Would it be true to say that you're a fan of President Ramaphosa? You spoke positively about him in your speech.
Well, I mean, is in many ways is a breath of fresh air from what I've had before. Definitely, certainly. Does he have weaknesses? Yes, he does. I mean, there are many weaknesses that he has, like most people. I mean, most of us, we have our own weaknesses. I think as a person, he has a good character, and I think he's capable. But I guess, locked in a system that is dysfunctional and looking at the depth of the destruction that corruption has caused, I think he has huge challenges in his hand.
Another practical question in relation to youth using social media, and certainly we saw that in Fees Must Fall, most definitely, and we saw that in North Africa. Do you feel that social media is going to, and you're the chair of MTN, so you have a vested interest in, your company has a vested interest in data being used. So what is your view on that?
I hope so. Look, the social media will continue to be crucial, as it were. Obviously, there are huge challenges. It could also work in both ways. It can be an effective, and as we are beginning to see, an effective tool for spreading fake news. But equally, I think it can be a very powerful liberator, etc. So it can play both roles, I think. But ultimately, I think we do need to increase access to digital instruments and tools, and some of the kind of debates about managing data, the price of data, etc., are relevant debates, by the way. As it were, all of us are grappling with those issues, and how do you deliver infrastructure in a more cost-effective way to ensure a broader and wider access to technology, as it were. And those are questions that I think both require private sector and in collaboration with the public sector to kind of resolve.
Mr. Jacobs asks, is there anything that you personally regret that you might have done or didn't do in your political career?
Look, if you look back, I think given the kinds of things that we went through, there are moments that obviously you would say that we've done well in some senses by kind of standing up earlier and becoming part of the fight against apartheid and actually being active in the reconstruction of New South Africa. Again, I think all of us sometimes, I feel, have one flaw. I think I always debate this with my friends. And the flaw is that there was a period where ANC was everything. And I think when I look back at the time that we could have been more critical, I think, because I think the robust intellectual engagement within the party is critical. And that not only holding it within the party, but publicly articulating your views and perspective is also equally important, because, and I suspect all of us like reach that point where we kind of assume that for debate to be kind of constructive, to be a disciplined cadre, means that you cannot in public point to your or express your views on any topic, as it were. And that's, I think, for the longest of time, I think all of us suffered from that position. If I can go back in history, I would say, I think critical thinking, critical engagement should be something that we uphold.
So do you think that Minister Mboweni is changing the narrative around that now? Because he's been quite outspoken about things. And
Yeah.
he holds the purse strings.
I hope he does. I mean, I wouldn't comment on the individuals, but I hope he does. I think, but I'm just saying there is value in robust engagement, as it were. I mean, there was a time even church leaders in the ANC were first ANC members, and before they were Christians or Muslims or whatever, you know. So, and I think that was a wrong position. That you have to be a Christian. If you are a Christian in the ANC, you've got to be a Christian in the ANC, a Christian first and foremost. And so that you can continuously engage with the positions that the party takes and so on and so on. So if you think about like Hitler and all the experiences in the world, part of the problem is that you suffocate intellectual debate, you know, and you kind of lift up the kind of sacrosanct party positions at the expense of like what you could add to them and strengthen them and dynamize them by kind of critical engagement.
So this leads to, again, another practical question. How do you make the ideologues for whom political loyalty is paramount pragmatic? How do you actually do that?
For me, I think the trick is practical. I think electorate is increasingly intolerant of non-performance. So people are not going to eat ideas. And let's face it, people need jobs practically. People need like to find good public health, good education, and so on and so on. And increasingly, you could almost say South Africans across the board, there are certain basic things that all of us, irrespective of our political party or persuasion, that we're looking for. Good education for our children, good public health system, etc., etc., etc. I think that the more we coalesce South Africans around those issues, the better, beyond the party lines, as it were. And we can't have a country that has no obsession, no single thing that we can kill for. I mean, like really say that in a sense that will engage you, will take you out of power if you don't do. I mean, if our education outcome continue to fail children of the poor and working class kids, etc., and we continue to accept that as normal, as if nothing has happened, if people continue to die in our hospitals, etc., and we continue to accept it as normal, then there's a problem. So my point is, I think one of the things that we need to increasingly do is to emphasize on those things that we all agree about, like good education, protecting the education system, improving it, and making our health system function better, and really become intolerant of scenarios where there are deficiencies in those areas. And I think we've not reached that. I mean, as South Africa, sometimes you find if you go through social media, sometimes you can go without any commentary about the genocide that happens in our schools in rural areas, in townships, etc., where the prospects for poor kids are decimated very early in life, or patients are dying, and etc. We're not even making those as issues. So there will be a big hullabaloo about issues that are not necessarily as fundamental as that and as essential as that. And if we can change that, I mean, in our narrative, start making those things matter, and ensuring that we kind of become more robust in indicating that there's high intolerance for those kinds of things. I mean, the better things I think might change. But at the moment, I think if we still want to look at education and say, from the party perspective, this is how it is, and somebody looks at it, but it is a general issue. We might quibble on the content and other things, but if, basic education is not functional, it doesn't deliver the goods. It's a fundamental human right issue, as it were. And until we reach the point where we do make it a fundamental human right in the practical sense that South Africans are intolerant of poor education.
So, so we're scheduled to go on for another 10 minutes, and certainly we can't get through all the questions, I think. So I apologize for those that have put questions and we don't get to them, but I certainly hope that we've done a good coverage of that. So for the last 10 minutes, so Mr. Jonas, this is your namesake who's obviously read your book, and that's fantastic. So he specifically refers to page 210 of your book, where you speak about releasing our tech potential. So what can young entrepreneurs do to champion the creation of a tech industry?
I guess, if you ask, I'll give you a broad swipe of a response. I think in essence, I think the more we create a greater partnership between academic institutions and the private sector, companies like MTN, Vodacom, and Telkom, around these particular issues, but also other companies that are involved in that space. The banks, financial services institutions, etc. I think we need to kind of embark on a more kind of coordinated effort to actually coordinate the skills development programs in that space, as it were. Secondly, also, I think create, as it were, openings in our supply chains for young entrepreneurs and young professionals to actually kind of be included in our supply chains around those areas. There has to be a conscious effort to open that space, as it were. And again, for me, it is a subject of collaboration, obviously, between the private sector and institutions of training, but it's also a policy issue. I think we need to deal with some of the political bottlenecks, spectrum release, and some of the kind of inherent weaknesses in the broad policy around technology and technology development. And we need also to increase funding for research and development, as it were, as a country. But also from the private sector side, also, we need to increase what our financial input into research and development, as well as government must actually realize the importance of research and development and start putting resources behind research and development.
Another very important question, and the students that come from the humanities faculty, and you come from a humanities background, how are you able to make the transition to commerce, business, politics? And that, I think, doesn't suggest that humanities graduates actually aspire to go to that in any event, but I think it's just interesting to know, given your background, how you made that transition, and what did you learn from being a humanities student?
I hold a view that says that I think university education should enable you, any person, I think, with university education should be able to transition in any different direction, I think. And if you have like solid grounding, it enables you to kind of be able to learn as quickly as possible, read and be guided, and as it were, in different directions. So I think my approach would be that it's exposure in the first instance, and it's mentoring and support from those who are steeped in those fields.
What is your take on SAA and Eskom right now? And maybe you're quite relieved that you're no longer the Deputy Minister of Finance.
I guess, the Eskom problem is that with Eskom. The Eskom thing is that I think, apart from, I think South Africa needs to have a transition. We need to kind of, and I know what policy says in terms of levels, but I think we need to do a major restructuring exercise and on the energy policy, broadly speaking. But sometimes whenever we talk about electricity and energy in South Africa policy and restructuring, we think about how to protect Eskom's balance sheet. And I think there is a bigger kind of sense of thinking about energy policy beyond the utility. And it's something that means that part of it is about ensuring that we increase the renewable energy component of our kind of system. It also means that we must actually ensure that there's greater private sector generation of electricity and begin to introduce a bit of competition in generation, and also to restructure Eskom in terms of the different units, distribution and generation, etc., to create a more performing entity. Obviously, I think in the next couple of years, the big question for Eskom is going to be, how do they get out of the debt crisis that they are kind of wrapped around in? And part of it lies in the restructuring. The other part of it is smart partnership with the private sector in generation and distribution, as it were, and in other aspects of technology, as it were. And that's probably the challenge that you need to manage. Coming back to SAA, but again, generally with SOCs, we again, this is for me the ideological debate, I think, about state ownership. I think we locked in the model that says the state, we maintain these SOCs because we believe that you're protecting the state. For me, I think a monopoly, whether it's state monopoly or private monopoly, is problematic. So part of like looking at the sector as a whole is to try to demonopolize the energy sector and create multiple players and competition. And that would ensure that, I mean, it creates better prices, it creates greater access for users, etc., and greater optionality for users, as it were. On SAA, I think, again, it's the same question that, and everybody talking about SAA, I always ask the question, protecting SAA as we're doing, what has it to do with the working class? Because people always say that it's for the poor and the working class. And as far as I'm understanding, those who fly SAA by and large are neither poor and most of them no working class. So this kind of myth that you protecting the working class needs to be dealt with in a serious way. The second point, of course, you could get better results by finding a strategic partner for SAA, and I think there are many players that have done well. Of course, the COVID-19 is complicated because all airlines are in trouble now. I mean, but major investments are being made by governments and companies into those. We don't have the capital to do that. So whether we like it or not, we cannot escape some model that allows for some strategic partnership or strategic equity within SAA that allows, if we want to sustain the flag, as it were, in my view, this could be an easy target for a different approach than that.
Well, the last two questions now, and again, I apologize to everybody who's put questions there. We couldn't get through all of them, so thank you so much. But I hope that at the end, the question that we have asked and the responses that Mr. Jonas has given does give a clue to some of the other questions that we get around to. So last two questions. One question here, shouldn't we be embracing a more African indigenous style of leadership and government, Ubuntu, communal leadership? And then the very last question after that is, the government has asked the private sector to come to the party. And the argument is the private sector has not. So how do we get the private sector to come to the party? So the African communal leadership, Ubuntu, and then the very last question, how do we actually get the private sector to come to the party?
Yeah. Well, I mean, those concept of communal leadership and Ubuntu are critical, I think. But I always say that leadership is also contextual. I think you also need to kind of temper with that. And I think if your idea about Ubuntu, etc., and I support that, you need that. But I think you must understand that we're exercising leadership in the context of getting stronger formal institutions, ensuring that these institutions serve people, and those ideas of Ubuntu matter in that context. But I think context is important. So you can conjure up all sorts of mix that you could have, but you should also take into cognizance the context within which you're looking at the concept of leadership. On the private sector coming and government, and I can get questions saying private sector has been invited and it didn't come. Again, I mean, that's probably true in some parts, but I don't think that's actually the truth, actually. Because I think the problem is that if you're asking private sector to invest in infrastructure, as government is, you've got to understand that you have to create the necessary policy environment that encourages that to happen. So I think if in all countries where investment promotion has been successful, it has been successful because there's been policy consistency, that there's been the right policy frameworks that allow, that reduce risks for the private sector. Nobody's going to put money where there's no consistency of policy. There are huge risks of policy changing, et cetera, et cetera. And until you kind of look at those issues of policy and regulation in a more kind of a progressive way than we have done, because regulation is not about control only. It should also be about generating certain outcomes. And I think once you start looking at those outcomes that you want to generate and actually asking yourself questions whether can they be generated through regulation or a different mechanism. And sometimes we stick to regulations and less about outcomes, as it were. And you need to look at regulation, policy, etc., whether to see whether it promotes private sector investment, as it were. And again, that also talks about procurement. That also talks. I mean, we used to have at some point. I mean, the mining sector was like robust, and we spent, I think, more than 7 years discussing the mining charter. For instance, we couldn't agree on the mining charter, for instance, for 7 years. So in that period, it means that you didn't have investment in the mining sector of any significance, as it were. So those are the kinds of things that I would think that you need to be aware that for private sector to thrive, you need to create an environment that allows it to thrive, both in policy, in regulation, sometimes also in support measures that you put in place. And then you can get better results. I mean, you go to all countries that have done that, they've been, I mean, very effective. I mean, even countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and I'm thinking developing countries where there's been success of building a more robust private sector and dynamic private sector, it has been a product of government being more kind of enlightened in terms of policy.
So at this point, we could applaud our speaker. So, you know, I say thank you very much. I'm clapping on behalf of everybody. And what we would do at this point is we would ask our class president to come and give you a vote of thanks, but it seems that we've lost him for the time being. So I will thank you on behalf of the 2019 MBA class. We're in the midst of our teaching block now, and I'm pleased to say that later on in the week they're having a session with Professor Mervyn King, and I'm pretty sure that some of the questions are going to raise to him around ethical leadership, authentic leadership, and so on. So thank you very much, really, for your time this evening, for presenting the 6th lecture. And just to quickly recap in relation to the action points you spoke about, really about the macroeconomic risk, sovereign debt cliff, productivity and innovation, creating dynamic Black entrepreneurs, high quality digital education, the renewable energy, the social justice that we need to, and deepen democracy in relation to our constitutionality, and then building the leadership capacity. And you really highlighted the ethical, authentic leadership, but you gave us some practical insights into what pragmatic leadership means. It's really about doing the job. Let's take the ideology out of it. Very strong focus tonight on the youth and youth leadership. And really, we hope that, that our educations of higher learning can really also partner with government again and the private sector to create the kind of entrepreneurs that that this country so desperately needs. And it seems that you can come from any faculty. It doesn't really matter what faculty you come from. So thank you very much, Mr. Jonas. On behalf of the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust, Rhodes University and Rhodes Business School, we thank you very much for being our sixth speaker. And unfortunately, we can't do it, but we would have given you a small gift as a token of our appreciation, and we will certainly make a plan to get that to you. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for participating this evening. We really appreciate you joining us. I thank you. And I say, because I'm in Durban, I say, Hamba Gashle, and everybody stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Brown, thank you.
So again, so Charmaine, I just want to say thank you to you and your team and everybody who helped to pull this event off tonight. We really do appreciate all the effort that you went into. It's really deeply appreciated.
Thanks, Owen. It was a pleasure.